But the Bruiser War happened in the early 70s because Dick the Bruiser. So the territory that Johnny Doyle and Jim Barnett had, that the Sheik bought, was actually a two-part territory. There was a northern end, which was the Detroit part of it, and then there was the southern wing, which was like into Indiana. And it used to be one big piece, and the Sheik really only took the kind of Michigan, Ohio part. The Indiana part was taken by Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder, and they really just took it by force. They did not buy it the way Sheik did. They just ran Barnett and Doyle out, and so they were very aggressive. That's the thing. They were very they were invasive. I mean, they didn't believe in playing ball. And look, let's face it, none of this was legal. So it's not like they really weren't doing anything wrong. If anything, the people that were doing wrong were Johnny Doyle and was the Sheik, because there's free enterprise, right? So Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder, they had this attitude that we're going to try to come in and take all of it. We have Indiana. We're going to try to move northwest, and we're going to take the whole thing. And this started in 1971, and it went on for about 2 to 3 years. Now, most promotional wars in those days, especially, did not last that long. It was one of the longest in the territorial era of wrestling. And the reason it went on so long is not because, let me put it this way, it wasn't because the Bruiser was winning, because he never was. It was simply because he refused to give up. He refused to leave. So if you look at the numbers, as I did, and you compare back and forth, because they'd be running sometimes on the same night. So you'd have the Sheik and Cobo Arena on one side of Detroit. You'd have the Bruiser in Olympia Stadium on the other side of Detroit, on the same night or on the same weekend, maybe. And almost every time, and I mean, this happened like dozens of times, almost every time the Sheik won, outdrew the Bruiser. There's a handful of times you could count on one hand and have fingers left over that the Bruiser actually drew more. But he had deep pockets. He had the promoter of the Olympia Stadium, Lincoln Cavalieri, on his side, who desperately wanted a piece of the wrestling pie. And it just kept going until it became an issue of television. In 73, the Sheik really started shaking things up by putting TV in the Bruiser's territory. And that pissed off Vern Gagne and the AWA too, because the AWA was working with Dick the Bruiser. And that's when they finally backed off, because they really started feeling like it could backfire on them. But the worst thing that happened was, once the heat had subsided, the war was over, the record crowds that they were drawing also started to dry up. They were putting 12,500 people capacity crowds on a weekly basis, bi-weekly basis, into Cobo. And then in a couple of years, it was 3, 4, 5,000 people, which ironically today is an average Raw or Dynamite taping. But back then it was death for your promotion if your main shows were doing that number. So it was a high peak and then a quick decline.